exploration success in the southern Cooper Basin and in South Australia and the Perth Basin in Western Australia. As outlined in the Managing Director's report to be read below, after a frustrating technical setback in earlier calendar year 2019, the JAWS project in South Australia was brought back online and has been carefully managed to maximise the chance of becoming a producer of commercial quantities of gas. Certainly Stuart will talk a lot about that in his presentation. With historically high gas prices in the East Coast, markets continuing to reflect constrained supply, as you can imagine, any success at JAWS has the propensity to positively impact on the supply dynamics. After acquiring a 50% interest in EP 469 in the Perth Basin in Western Australia in 2018 and identifying a prospective resource fairway in the basin, Strike quickly consolidated its position in that basin by acquiring substantial additional acreage over that fairway via the takeover of ASX-listed UIL Energy Limited. Both of these actions are testament to the risk-tolerant ethos of the company and its willingness to back a credible scientific thesis regarding the likely presence of hydrocarbons at extreme depth. For a market with a modest market capitalisation and negligible cash flows, the stakes were high. And Stuart will say, one of his slides I think is referred to the dramatic reduction in exploration by small companies in this field in Australia. As you're aware, the West Erregulla 2 well has proved to be an unprecedented success with an attendant substantial uplift in the value of the company. Strike has also confirmed a gross contingent resource of 1.185 BCF2C at West Erregulla just in the last week or so. Buoyed by this success, Strike will conduct 3D seismic surveys on 100% company-owned acreage in the Perth Basin. Finally, I acknowledge with thanks the hard work and dedication of Strike's board members, management and staff, and add my sincere thanks to you, our loyal shareholders, for your support again this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I want to take the opportunity today to not only celebrate the success and the technical achievements that have been brought out over the last year in the Perth Basin, but also to walk you through where the company is headed and our future strategy in the Perth Basin. I know that there have been a lot of questions around you found a lot of gas in Western Australia, and what does that mean? And I'm going to hopefully illuminate some of the reasons why we believe that the fundamentals of the company are very strong going into the future. So this is just an important notice that you need to take on board, that the basis for all the information in today's presentation is founded in good technical expertise, as well as this does not represent an offer or a financial product. So as you can see, the board has continued to evolve over the last 12 months. We've appointed Mr. Neville Power as our Deputy Non-Executive Chairman. Getting somebody of the calibre of Nev to join the Strike board shows the level of achievement that we have been able to go through over the last 12 months. Nev is the previous MD and CEO of Fortescue Metals Group, and really took Andrew Forrest's vision of what that resource could be to what that massive powerhouse and the lowest cost iron ore producer in the world is today. And that's been a really exciting addition to the board, and coupled with our existing members, I believe that the company is well founded now with an excellent board and management team that will be able to realise the strategy that I'm about to present to you today. Now, whilst there has been a reduction in the market price of our shares in the last week and a half to 2 weeks, we are still representing a substantial gain in shareholder value over the previous 12 months. We're talking in the orders of multiple hundreds of %. And so whilst we believe that the company is trading at a discount to its fundamental value today, we still believe that this has been the end of a very, very successful period of time for the company. I want to take you through a video which will be made available on the website. But this just goes to show you some of the technical achievements that have occurred in the last few months at West Erregulla. The company's evolving when they end up with a video at the AGM, I think. Here we go. That's not planned. Okay, so the reason why I believe Strike is a wonderful investment today, and why you should be very happy to be shareholders, is that we have an enormously large gas resource that we've found in Western Australia, which has proven to be very highly productive, very recoverable. It's 9 kilometres from its major transmission line, and therefore represents a very low-cost source of gas. The company, as a result of its recent capital raising, is now very well funded. We are, for the first time in my time at Strike, we have a good pathway to deliver a plan. We have the sufficient funds to be able to do that. Where we have found our gas in Western Australia and the function of it being a low-cost source of gas, we believe that the market fundamentals for gas demand in Western Australia are increasing. We believe the market is tightening. Potential prospective supplies are likely to be more long dated than what the market is expecting, and therefore we see a very supportive economic environment for our West Erregulla discovery. The significant upside, which John mentioned through our UIL acquisition, where we decided to acquire the land around West Erregulla because we have drilled the deepest well ever drilled in Australia's history. We have found the deepest hydrocarbons ever found in Australia. And we believe that this is only the beginning of a very large fairway of significant other discoveries that will be made in both the Strike acreage as well as the neighbouring Beach Mitsui acreage. And then lastly is the low-cost nature of that, as I have said, in a market which is often perceived as well supplied with gas. There is nothing that sits on the cost curve where Strike's gas is currently looking to be positioned. And so this picture I could probably speak to for the entire time, but this is the fundamental basis of what has gone on over the last several months. You can see West Erregulla where it sits amongst the discovery of the Waitsia gas field as well as the Bahara Springs Deep, and you can start to see that this trend into the Dandaragan Trough is evolving very quickly. There's been around 6.5 TCF discovered in the Cooper Basin. I believe that this is the beginning of another Cooper Basin. We've got sort of what might be very close to 3 TCF already discovered between Waitsia, West Erregulla and Bahara Springs Deep, and you can see that Beach and Strike have mapped significant size leads towards the southeast as you move into that trough. The drilling of West Erregulla has proven that the porosity preservation mechanisms required to have effective reservoir at depths at 5,000 metres are indeed still in play and are effective. The discovery of West Erregulla, you can see the substantial size resource which is now in our portfolio, which is over 500 BCF of 2C recoverable gas, with the upside of the Wodgina gas still to potentially make its way into that 2C contingent resource category. We own all of our adjoining acreage at 100%. That is a very privileged position to be in. Whilst we begin to start to shoot seismic and start to define additional prospectivity in the leads that we've already seen, as well as into the areas of the trough which are currently undefined, we have equity in those permits that we will be able to use to potentially fund the exploration activities there, whilst we concentrate our appraisal and development expenditure on West Erregulla and moving that into cash flow. This is the key takeaways from our understanding of the West Australian gas market, but I will go into the West Australian gas market in depth because it is what I realised when I was doing the roadshow for the capital raising is that there has not actually ever really been an ASX-listed West Australian domestic gas-focused company. The West Australian gas market has often always been a sideshow of major LNG investment from super majors in the Woodsides of the world, and therefore it hasn't actually been a key investment thesis for any other listed company in Australia, and therefore the understanding of that market is quite immature in comparison to a deep and well publicised East Coast gas market. So what we see in Western Australia is a market which its future volumes are dependent on taking FIDs of major projects. There is some $30 to $40 billion of projects that will need to take FID in order for future prospective gas supplies in Western Australia to keep the market in balance. Those future supplies are all much further up the cost curve. This is what I would call LNG Phase 2 in Western Australia. This is your Scarboroughs and your Browse, which are quite talked about at length in the Australian and the AFR, Woodside, Shell, etc. These are very expensive projects. Their associated domestic gas will be much further up the cost curve than the previous series of LNG associated domestic gas. And what we are seeing is several technical and commercial hurdles that those major projects still need to overcome. There is a lot of joint venture misalignment in both Scarborough and Browse at this point in time, and the FIDs are being noted. The FID for Browse certainly last week was given a 6-month delay, and so therefore the timing of that new supply is uncertain. When you hold that up against the mirror of what Strike's portfolio has, we have a development-ready asset which is incredibly low cost due to its large denominator, its size, but also the small numerator in its quality, the amount of capital that will be required to extract it. Very low cost, and because it is onshore, it sits on Crown land 9 kilometres away from the major transmission pipeline of Western Australia. We can take a fast and flexible nature in the development of that asset and actually throttle the development to suit the market conditions. So I'm going to just take you through how do we get to those conclusions. I'll push through it quite quickly. If you do have a question, please let me know. I'm happy to answer as we go. What we see here is a chart that when the West Australian government puts this up in their speeches, they often colour those yellow bars with the blue bars the same colour. If you were looking at that, you would think to yourself that this is a relatively well-balanced gas market. But those yellow bars are actually future projects which haven't taken FID at this point in time. When we break out those yellow bars, we can see there are 4 key projects which represent almost 100% of the future prospective supply in Western Australia. 77% of that future gas has currently got a big question mark over it. We've got the Equus gas, which is the old Hess project. Hess spent up $1.5 billion on the Equus project and handed it over to Western Gas because they were unable to get it to work. It's very technically challenging. The Waitsia project is currently being earmarked for much larger volumes for potential LNG backfill, so it is unlikely to be a substantial West Australian domestic gas project. And then Scarborough and Browse, which is the big lever in this picture here, 270 terajoules a day of West Australian domestic gas, that has already been earmarked for a delay to its FID. It is a heavily compartmentalised series of offshore fields that needs an 800 kilometre subsea pipeline tied back to the LNG facilities on the Northwest Shelf. Currently you have the disagreement between a 5-party joint venture versus a 6-party joint venture, which are misaligned on the costs and the timelines and the development of that project, I see substantial and potential delays coming from Browse, which will leave this market in a critically undersupplied situation moving into the 2020s. Now, is there anything that can come in and save the day? Has there been a discovered resource which can come in and take and supplant that Browse gas? Unfortunately, Western Australia has gone into a critical decline of drilling, both exploration and development drilling. We've seen an 81% reduction over the last 10 years. And that's a function of the West Australian market being really heavily geared towards international investment, and other parts of the world now being, quite attractive places to look for more oil and gas. The US, for instance, parts of East Africa, and therefore all of the discoveries that have been made in the previous sort of 10 years are being tied into those LNG pieces of infrastructure, or there have been major oil discoveries. There is no uncommercialised major gas field that is ready to go, sitting behind there to take the place of any delayed projects. Enter West Erregulla, a flexible, a fast, development-ready asset which we have got right next to the pipeline. Now, when we look at the West Australian gas market, it is a 1,300 terajoule a day gas market, which is almost the same size as the entire East Coast market unto itself. One of the key things to note in Western Australia is that it is a market that is heavily institutionalised in the use of gas. Over 95% of the gas consumed every day is on long-term contract, which is very different to what you have in the East Coast of Australia, and these are very long-term contracts. And so you can see here from this picture that we've got substantial transmission infrastructure in Western Australia, where there are actually known growth segments of this market. Both in the goldfields and the Pilbara, you have resources companies who are extracting iron ore or minerals or processing gold or lithium, which are paying north of $7 a gigajoule because they're burning diesel to generate their electricity. The reason why these pipelines through the Pilbara and the goldfields are running at 100% capacity is because nobody is marketing long-term reliable sources of gas for the pipeline companies to expand that infrastructure. What you can see from the pie charts is a emerging capacity in domestic gas plants. The reason why this is happening is it is a function of molecules, not a function of infrastructure, and therefore WA is a very large, robust gas market which has got this upstream shortage which is starting to emerge, and we're very well timed with the discovery of West Erregulla. Now, West Australian gas prices are soon to be a function of LNG, and to talk you through what works in WA, there's a thing called the domestic market obligation, which does not exist here in the East Coast markets. The domestic market obligation is a function where 15% of the FID resource or final investment decision resource of those LNG projects must be put into the WA market. However, that gas does not need to go into the WA market at a discount to the break-even economics. It doesn't have to be economically destructive to the LNG owners. What we're looking from here, and this is a picture that Shell has put together, is an emerging supply and demand gap in global LNG. Now, what we have in Western Australia is several very large LNG projects that are heavily overcapitalised and some of the most expensive LNG in the world. As we start to see this emerging supply and demand gap in LNG, we are expecting the LNG price to respond and rise, which will therefore trigger future LNG investment. But what that means for West Australian LNG producers is that it is a much more buoyant and strong market to place their LNG cargoes into. So therefore, once they reach their domestic market obligation and no longer have to supply their domestic market gas into WA, they will be pushing their cargoes out into the North Asian markets, into these LNG markets, and to trigger a redirection of LNG gas into West Australian domestic gas, you will need to see the West Australian gas price close with the LNG net back price into Australia. This is a similar pricing fundamental and function, which is what is occurring in the East Coast of Australia, hence why the East Coast gas prices have risen to a point where LNG producers in Queensland are considering whether they put LNG into the market or are they putting domestic gas at $8, $9, $10 a gigajoule into the East Coast markets. And so we're starting to see the emergence of these same fundamentals occurring in Western Australia. When we look at West Australian gas prices, historically long-term gas prices have been around $5 a gigajoule. What we can see in this chart here in the blue line is the weighted average cost of supply of WA gas. Typically it's been around about $3 to make gas in Western Australia, and it's been getting sold at around $5, which is sort of the break-even economics of LNG. Now the Northwest Shelf, which has been online since the mid-80s, and some of the substantial domestic gas fields owned by Santos are declining, and as a result, those legacy fields, which are the lower cost of supply at the moment, are coming off, and we're ending up with a much higher weighting towards the recent LNG-related gas, the Gorgons, the Plutos, and the Wheatstone gas. What that means is that we're starting to see a rise in the cost of supply of West Australian gas. That is, and as I sort of spoke about before, the way that the domestic market obligation works is that gas does not need to be sold at a discount to its break-even price by these LNG producers. So you can see as you start to take investment decisions in these future projects, with Scarborough here and Browse here, you are dramatically increasing the weighted average cost of supply of West Australian gas, where there will be a new price floor in the West Australian market at around $6 a gigajoule. Enter West Erregulla yet again, which is going to be a dramatically lower cost of gas in Western Australia, which has not been seen before, because no one has found these very large onshore gas fields in WA. It's typically been an offshore industry. This just talks to a state, Western Australia, which could be, if it was its own country, the third largest LNG producer of the world, still burns about 45% of its electricity in coal. So whilst the state has been awash with gas over the previous decade, it has not actually supplanted the way that electricity generation has occurred in Western Australia. There is a significant movement to emissions reductions in Western Australia as a result of the Environmental Protection Authority working with the state government. As a simple movement from coal to gas, you can reduce your carbon intensity by 60%. That 45% of the daily electricity generated by coal can be substantially offset by just moving that to gas. By moving to gas, you can increase the rate of penetration of your renewables. Western Australia is a very sunny place. I suggest you visit it at some point in time. And you can see when we look at Germany, which is actually a sort of a country in the world which has the highest rate of penetration of renewables, you can see that it's an underlying base load of gas which is supportive of the supplanting of coal and bringing in more solar and wind. And so this is very high on the state government agenda. So gas markets are likely to increase as we move away from coal over the coming decades and move into more gas-fired electricity. Now, West Erregulla, I've told you the sort of market that it fits in. Now I'm going to tell you how we're going to extract the greatest amount of value for the shareholders via its development. We've decided that we're going to progress what we call a staged or a phased development. Two stages, phase 1 and phase 2, which will be developed individually. As you can see, the timelines for these are along the bottom here. Likely to bring phase 1 gas, which will be somewhere between 25 to 75 terajoules a day online by 2022. And then we'll move into the full field development between 100 to 200 terajoules a day in 2024 to 2025. The reason why we are doing this staged development is that West Erregulla luckily sits amongst quite abundant gas infrastructure, gas plants and gas transmission lines. By staging it, we can facilitate the delivery of cash flow into Strike a lot quicker, which will in turn reduce our cost of capital. As we reduce our cost of capital before moving into a very large development for phase 2, we will optimise our financial and corporate objectives whilst being able to invest in phase 2 with both a mixture of senior debt and free cash flows. Some of the strategic advantages of sequencing this development is that we will allow the time for this West Australian gas market situations to sort of to play out. We might see additional delays to these mega projects in WA, which will increase the the quality of the market that we look to place the very large material amounts of gas that we have in phase 2. And then lastly, we will be able to start to explore in all of our adjoining acreage, define additional resources, optimise and size that phase 2 development infrastructure so that we can actually capture all of the resources that we discover over the next several years and tie that all in together into phase 2. Now, we're not going to be everything to everyone. We're going to be a very upstream focused company. We are not here to create the next Santos or and own large amounts of infrastructure and gas plants, etc. We are very good in the upstream. We have drilled the longest, deepest horizontal ever in Australia's history. We've drilled the deepest well ever in Australia's history. We've found the deepest hydrocarbons. Our geosciences, our well delivery is excellent. We are, for a small company, performing in the top tier of that segment. And that's really where we're going to focus a lot of our time. It's taken 1.5 billion bits of paper or so over the journey of Strike over several decades to get to this point in time. We're now going to focus our capital, additional capital that we raise in the future, into the highest returning segment, which is that upstream segment, rather than into the processing and transmission parts of the value chain, where several infrastructure companies around Australia are very well known to want to look after these opportunities. And lastly, we are going to remain focused, lean, and nimble. It is part of our competitive differentiator of why Strike will continue to be a success as we go forward, and that is certainly where we want to focus our time and attention. Now, the phase 1 sort of concept, we're looking at the discovery of West Erregulla. You can see a very strong statement of confidence from Strike when we drilled West Erregulla 2. We drilled it as a future producer, so that well will be there for several decades now, so you can see it in the middle, and that will get tied into the 2 appraisal wells which we plan to drill in the second half of the upcoming calendar year, West Erregulla 3 and 4. In the same time, we're looking at potentially APA to build us a pipeline from their gas plant in Mondara to West Erregulla, or potentially down to the Bahara Springs gas plant, where we will use that existing infrastructure and those existing pipeline corridors to accelerate our cash flow. And this is currently what we are seeing as the phase 1 development, and that is why we can go from discovery to production and cash flow in a 2-year time frame, which is incredibly fast. For that phase 2, I guess one thing I wanted to talk through was in a market, even in the most bearish case, a market which is, if all the gas in Western Australia all came online and the state became awash with gas yet again, as being what we aspire to being the lowest cost producer, which is a function of the quality of the discovery that we have made, we believe that in a race to the bottom, we are still going to win, because no one will be able to compete with our cost of supply. As I've explained to you, the domestic market obligation puts an artificial floor on the price of gas in WA, and everything in between below that price is Strike's territory to own and win. And so in a WA gas market, which is already 1,200 to 1,300 terajoules a day, we believe that as contracts roll off, we will not be able, the offshore fields will not be able to compete with Strike in securing that demand. However, if we were to continue looking for growth in the West Australian gas market, we know, as I've described earlier, that there is growth in the Pilbara and the goldfields. There are several, due to the strategic and advantage location of West Australia, several chemicals projects that are looking for long-term gas supplies to be secured. We could be enabling the development of chemicals in petrochemicals in Western Australia. It's my belief that there is going to be third-party gas required at some of the LNG facilities as initial resources roll off before those second phase of resources can roll on. We will be able to tender for those supplies. And the last piece of that is the next generation of power in Western Australia, supplanting that coal, keeping that gas-fired power, existing gas-fired power ongoing. And so the quality and the size of our discovery allows us not only to capture the existing market, but we can increase the size of the market. So when people say to me, Stu, you found a lot of gas in Western Australia, so what? I say, well, the absolute total breadth of development options are available to us because of the amount of infrastructure that's already in place and how simple and sort of the small aerial extent of West Erregulla makes it very, very low cost to develop it. Now, this is the timeline that we are putting forward as what the company is now sort of embarking on. And you can see it's broken into phase 1, phase 2, and what I call resource addition. Now, phase 1 is a process where we are looking to go through our concept select and either select the APA or the beach or potentially other third-party gas plant to tie the West Erregulla field into and look to start producing that 25 to 75 terajoules a day. We'll move through that process and we get to our phase 1 FID at the end of the next calendar year, which is a function of engineering work that's required, appraisal drilling in West Erregulla 3 and 4, as well as some commercial contracts and permitting, moving West Erregulla into a production license. And that will be starting up in the first half of 2022 and looking to produce gas and bring the company into cash flow at that point in time. In parallel, we're going to be assessing what's the best thing to do with our, on a gross basis, TCF of gas. There's a very small amount of gas that is required to underpin the development of phase 1. We have secured Wesfarmers as a major offtake customer as part of that phase 1 development. So now we can spend a lot of our commercial time assessing, is it petrochemicals, is it new electricity markets, is it the Pilbara gas market expansion, or is it filling the existing major contracts in Western Australia, Alcoa, CITIC, there's several, FMG, BHP, Rio, several major gas contracts which are looking to roll off and looking for new sources of supply, which we'll be able to tender for. And so we'll get to what we call our phase 2 concept select, which is more of a commercial construct rather than a physical engineering construct, because in all cases, the gas comes out of the field, goes into a gas plant, goes into the pipeline. It's depending upon where does that pipeline take it, what is the new infrastructure that we are going to underpin the building of, or the gas market that we're looking to, or existing gas contracts we're looking to supply. And then lastly, there's the resource addition piece. We have a lot of acreage in the Perth Basin, which is highly prospective for these Permian gas-prone targets in the Wodgina, the Kingia and the Highcliffe, and that is exactly what we're going to spend a lot of time doing, is adding additional resource, because the more resource that we put together, the cheaper that the development gets, the lower cost of our gas becomes, the higher margin that we will make going forward. But lastly, it also increases the breadth of, what are the development options? Potentially, if between Beach, Mitsui and Strike, if we all are as successful as we would like to be, is there enough gas there to underpin new build of LNG infrastructure? We'll have to wait to see how the exploration programs go. But at the moment, we've got Waitsia, West Erregulla and Bahara Springs Deep, so this fairway is emerging very quickly. The next 12 months, what have we raised the capital to deliver for the shareholders? It is a mixture of development, appraisal and exploration. On the appraisal and the development side, as I said, we're going to be drilling 2 wells in West Erregulla in the second half of next year, which will confirm the Kingia reservoir characteristics as we have defined them, which underpins the bulk of our existing 2C resource booking. We'll also conduct flow tests on the Highcliffe, and we would like to look at a way that we can convert the Wodgina into a 2C resource or even into a reserve. And that will come as a result of additional laboratory work on the existing samples and information that has been gathered, but also additional drilling into that formation. In the development side, we're going to be going through substantial engineering works, full field development, understanding, looking at how are we going to put the upstream of West Erregulla together. That will all come together in concert for a phase 1 FID at the end of the calendar year 20. And then lastly is on the exploration side of this, we are defining the additional high value prospects in the Permian gas fairway, and also looking to further define the other parts of our portfolio. You can see that we've got a substantial acreage position in the Perth Basin, where it stretches from West Erregulla in the north all the way down to Walyering in the south. It's bounded by gas discoveries We are right in the smack bang in the middle of the Dandaragan Trough. It is a very, very hydrocarbon-rich area, and we have shown what the application of good geoscience off the back of good quality seismic data can do. We've turned a piece of land which everyone said was going to be too deep, it won't hold anything of substantial value, to hosting one of the largest conventional gas fields ever found in Australia. And so that is why we're remaining focused in the upstream, because that is how we add the quickest amount of value to the shareholders, is by defining additional resources and bringing them together and getting them into the market as quickly as possible. Right now we're shooting some 3D seismic over the Walyering gas field. That was discovered in the 1970s. It's sort of, land access has been an issue there. There's some mineral sands mines. It's only been defined on very, very old legacy 2D seismic. We believe, yet again, the application of quality data will unveil the size and exactly where that gas field continues. And we're looking to potentially bring in additional companies throughout our portfolio where we own 100% equity to help us explore as we go forward. So we put this chart out several weeks ago. You know, it's got milestones in which we want to deliver against and ones that we're expecting to occur in the broader Perth Basin, which would have an impact to the Strike portfolio. As you can see, we are delivering, and we're making a track record of delivery, and that is why you can say right now that the fundamentals of this company, the strategy, the plan put together, we're substantially undervalued, and therefore we're looking for your continued and ongoing support as we continue to progress this project through to full value creation. And then our East Coast portfolio and Jaws, which is we're in South Australia, and this is in the Perth Basin, so quite topical. The Jaws project continues to remain prospective. We see evidence of gas and water production, which we believe warrants additional piloting. Right now, the plan is to continue the process of which we have been following for the last 7 months since we had the workover event that occurred in February 2019. And we're looking at a very, very gradual, slow drawdown of the water in the coal seam in order to bring as much coal as possible into the desorption window. Now, when you look at, people often ask me, Stu, when is this all going to happen? Unfortunately, due to the pioneering nature of this project, there are very few analogous fields of this nature that have ever been approached for development, let alone the amount of rigour that we've put into the Southern Cooper via both the Jaws and the Clem projects. There are coal seams in Queensland which have been some of the most prospective and highly productive coal seams as part of that LNG to CSG to LNG projects, which have taken 12 months or so to dewater before coming into major gas flows. At this point in time, we have a coal body which is thicker than anyone has ever tried to depressurise before. It's deeper than what anyone has ever tried to extract coal seam gas. We believe that the reasons why we drilled Jaws remain on foot, and we're going to continue this process. I understand that patience is required here. There is a lot of activity happening in Western Australia to generate the continued interest. Jaws remains prospective. It will continue to do what we are currently doing in the belief that at a certain point in time, enough coal will come into communication with the wellbore and start to produce gas in a meaningful manner. As you can see, water has remained stable over the last month of updates or so at around 300 barrels a day, and we're hitting instantaneous gas rates up to sort of 50,000 in the day. The bottom hole pressures are going to be very, very, very gradually reduced, if not just held where it is, and we're using the natural drive of that reservoir to deplete itself over the coming months. So, huge amount of upside if we can take this project from where it is to a commercial outcome, and so therefore we're following that process. We don't want a reoccurrence of what happened in February 2019, where we were a little bit hasty in the drawdown profile, which we, the benefit of hindsight there, and as a result, had to work the well over. We want this drawdown profile to be maintained, and we want to see where this project will go in the next few months. So I'd say bear with us, give us patience, but that is the best technical way to take it forward. And that's all I had to talk about today. I'm happy to answer any questions now, if you like, on anything we've discussed today, or we can wait till the end.
So it's Jaws down to 224 PSI?
That's what it says, yes, that's correct.
Good.
Yep.
Awesome. That's good.
Question, what's the commercial rate for flow out of Jaws? Is it 500 million cubic feet a day or certainly not 40 or 50?
Correct, otherwise we'd be making much bigger sort of song and dance about it at the moment. Commercial rates are a function actually of ultimate recovery, right? And so typically with coal seam gas you get very low production rates but larger ultimate recoveries, which is spanned over a 20-year time horizon. Now, commercial rates are also a function of what's the price that you're going to pay for the gas. Right now, we don't disclose what we believe a commercial rate is because we have forward contracted this gas to Orica, Aurora and Brickworks, and therefore by virtue of that you can reverse engineer the pricing of those contracts in which we need to keep commercially sensitive at this point in time. We're looking for substantially more gas than what we're currently producing.
At least a million, 1.1.
If that's your technical interpretation, then sure. I mean, as I said, I've been quite clear on that we believe that the Jaws system is in communication with about a square kilometre of this coal, which would point to a recovery of around 4 petajoules of sales gas over a very long period of time, over 20 plus years.
Stuart, is the Western Australia 3 and 4, are they 50% of Warrego?
That's right, so Warrego and Strike remain 50-50 in the joint venture. So we're looking at bringing in substantial cost reductions into our forward program, given that we now know how some of these formations behave as you start to drill through them. What's the best relationship between weight on bit, RPM, and torque, etc. And so what's the right drill bit? What's the new combination of motors, etc. And so as a result of that, we think that we can realise additional savings whilst drilling bigger wells, which will ultimately not be constrained by their engineering in terms of being able to really show what the reservoir can flow at.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, go for it.
Now, what did WE2 cost to build?
WE2, I mean, given that they had 3 exploration targets which were all successful, there was a very large amount of data gathering in there. The way that I would look at it at West Erregulla 2 is around $16 million drilling cost, with evaluation being on top of that. You wouldn't necessarily evaluate all the future wells in the same way going forward because you've already extracted some of that data. When you look at Bahara Springs Deep, which was drilled down to about 4,000 metres, they drilled that in around 35 days. And when you go and you apply that same depth to West Erregulla 2, we drilled that in about 41 days. So we were only sort of about 6 days behind Bahara Springs Deep. It was that journey from 4,000 metres to 5,100 metres, which is a journey that no one in Australia has ever been on, which was applied some of the technical challenges which we believe we can reduce the costs of those going forward.
So 3 and 4 you're going to drill?
Yep.
The 35 million's enough?
Well, because we're paying 50-50 with Warrego, part of the reason why the expenditure was high for West Erregulla 2 was that we were exercising our farm-in obligation. We had an $11 million carry to provide to the joint venture before Warrego started chipping in. So it's great to be going 50-50 now.
Just a quick one, Stewie. On the borderline there, the yellow patches, they seem to cross over the beach.
Yes.
What's the go there? With does that have to be shared or?
Generally, there's a thing called the rule of capture.
Yeah.
So I can talk about a gas field at Ichthys and Prelude, which are an INPEX and a Shell project. They're in communication. Generally, what happens is people drill their wells along the boundaries and start to deplete the reservoir as close to the other person's side as possible. But what is evidenced here is that there's really a large amount of room for collaboration with Beach and Mitsui, to reduce costs, to increase the level of technical diligence put into the exploration programs along there. And whilst we see prospectivity that sits on this border here, because no one has ever thought to go exploring into the trough, there is just an absolute dearth of seismic information along this area here, where we believe, looking at the fault terraces that come down from, this is Erregulla here, we believe that there will be additional Kingia high cliff targets, 100% captured in our own permits as well.
Yeah. Are you thinking about looking at them before approaching Beach for the other half things, or?
So Beach in early 2020 is looking to shoot what's called the Trieste 3D seismic campaign, which will be shot over this area here. It encroaches into our permits to try and capture some of that full fold delineation of these targets here. We're in discussions with Beach about how can we collaborate more, maybe extend that seismic campaign, and reduce the costs for both operators.
Cool.
There'll be time for some more questions at the conclusion of the formal part of the meeting. Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, John.